So the other thing that the SDG caucus does is we want to work at multiple different levels. And I know there's a lot of interest in localizing the SDGs. In other words, thinking about what happens at the community level and how cities can lead on the SDGs, as well as producing more, dialogue. I'm a big believer in not only learning, because I am myself a professor. I'm a professor of political science at Okanagan College. And I think a lot about environmental issues and about the role of the SDGs as these global goals towards which we want an all of society response. And I know that I would be remiss if I didn't note that we just recently had the release of the IPCC summary report, and the urgency of acting on environmental issues has never been more clear to all of us. So with that, I'm immensely thankful to welcome Zoe Craig-Sparrow. She is from Justice for Girls. She's a director. Justice for Girls is a nonprofit organization that promotes social, economic, and environmental justice with a mission to end poverty, violence, and racism. And I know that Zoe will tell us a lot more about the work of her organization. I had asked Cass to say a little bit more about RCEN before we move to our speaker. So Cass, over to you.
Yeah, so RCEN, the Canadian Environmental Network, is an independent, nonpartisan organization. We support environmental NGOs by providing them with valuable networking and communication services, creating opportunities to participate in national and international meetings, conferences, workshops, and consultations, as well as offering a transparent, bilingual, and democratic delegate selection process. RCEN is also a membership-based organization, so you can join us too for the following membership benefits. So one thing is access to national caucuses like the SDG caucus. Like I said, opportunities to become a delegate in government consultations, networking opportunities, and access to different tools and resources. So for more information on RCEN, you can visit our website. It's rcen.ca. And with that, I'll pass it back over to you, Roz.
Thank you so much. Zoe, would you like to take it away?
Absolutely. Okay, let me attempt to share my screen here. Hopefully. Okay, can you see the slide? Is that right?
Yeah.
I have two screens, two desktops, so I just want to make sure I'm sharing the right one here.
That looks good.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Zoe Craig-Sparrow, and I'm honored to be here to share a bit about myself and my work and the work of Justice for Girls. My work in particular focuses on the intersection between women's rights, children's rights, Indigenous rights, and the environment. And so, as Roz said, Justice for Girls, we're a Canadian nonprofit and registered charity that promotes social, economic, environmental, Indigenous justice for girls. And our mandate is primarily to serve girls aged 12 to 18, so teenage girls in particular. So with that comes an emphasis on children's rights and women's rights, and specifically how that relates to girls and their experiences. And then my role really brings in the environmental and Indigenous elements as well to that, and to the experiences of Indigenous women and girls. So today, rather than focus on specific sustainable development goals, I just wanted to share more broadly about my experience and expertise on environmental protection in Canada and its intersections with human rights, gender, indigeneity. As a human rights scholar and activist, I employ a human rights-based approach to environmental justice, and I'll be sharing a bit about what that framework entails, including how I apply international human rights law standards in my advocacy in various ways. And I also hope to instill the importance of ensuring that any solutions to address these inequalities must be led by the people who are experiencing them. So really like emphasizing, you know, the leadership of Indigenous people, children, women, and girls in this work as well. So a bit about me. I am Musqueam. I was born and raised on the Musqueam Reserve in what is now known as Vancouver. I'm the daughter of Laura Sparrow, and my grandparents are Musqueam elders, Edward and Susan Sparrow. I have my Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, so I'm also interested in poli-sci. I have my Master's in Human Rights from the University of London, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD in Human Rights as well. As a Musqueam woman, there are some very important things you should know about me. The Musqueam people are matriarchal, which means our societal power rests with women. The Musqueam people have lived along the Fraser River for over 10,000 years. And throughout time, our women have been our weavers, our knowledge keepers. They've been our life givers, our healers, and also our community's most ferocious protectors and last line of defense. So our women stay home, not just because they're great at watching the children, but because should anyone get past the men and make their way to the women in our community, they will take care of business. Accordingly, I come from a long line of matriarchs and strong women who I look up to, and I work really hard to embody the culture, teachings, and strength of the ancestors who came before me. I'm also, you know, professionally, I am a fellow at the David Suzuki Foundation. I am the Indigenous Rights and Environment Fellow. I am also Director of Indigenous Rights and Environmental Justice at Justice for Girls. And I'm also an expert in women and children's rights, Indigenous peoples, and ecocide with an organization called Just Planet. Beyond that, as I mentioned, I'm also a PhD student at the University of London, working on my dissertation that focuses on the relationship between ecocide and genocide in Canada, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. The photo you see here is me at the age of 15. So I started, I guess, my professional activism career at the age of 12 when I first did an internship with Justice for Girls. And that internship focused on criminal justice and girls caught in the justice system. And I got a taste of working with Justice for Girls and couldn't stay away. And after that, at the age of 15, I did my second internship. And this was a joint internship with Justice for Girls and the David Suzuki Foundation, where I looked at how climate change and environmental degradation violates children's rights, and my rights in particular as an Indigenous girl. So then at the age of 15, myself and another young woman named Reka, who was 13 at the time, we co-authored a submission to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, and then traveled to Geneva to speak with the committee members directly about our experiences and our concerns. And so this was really my first, I guess, taste, you could say, of realizing that I could combine my passion for Indigenous peoples, Indigenous rights, gender equality, and the environment together, and really learned the value of my perspective and my experiences and how I could use that to affect change. I think it's also pretty cool evidence that children, as I said, you know, can be the experts of their own experience and can speak on their behalf. So it was interesting because we were the only children there, and I think that said a lot considering it was a review of Canada by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And we were the only kids there, but the committee was also very keen to speak with us. And there's been, since then, there's a lot more engagement with children, but I think it's important to note that a lot of the time, the people that these events are speaking about, those people are not in the room. So it was exciting to be there, and it's definitely kickstarted my career. So I'd be remiss not to mention it. And since then, I have stayed obviously connected with Justice for Girls as a volunteer and a board member before I ultimately was brought on as co-director of the organization at the age of 21 and led the expansion of the organization and then ultimately restructuring of the organization into 4 program areas with directors. So now our organization is led by a leadership team. And that's my role on the leadership team, is working in Indigenous rights and environmental justice. So I feel like I'm living the dream. I get to go to school, I get to work on my PhD, I get to do activism, and I get to help lead a really incredible nonprofit organization. So that's a bit about me. Getting into the good stuff, let's talk a little bit about intersectionality. As I'm sure most of you know, environmental degradation, including climate change, does not affect all people equally. Climate change is fundamentally a human rights issue. Its causes and consequences are rooted in a system of global capital that pursues the natural riches of the planet and leaves a trail of poverty, social inequality, and environmental destruction in its wake. Indigenous peoples, women, and children, especially young Indigenous girls, are disproportionately impacted. And unfortunately, those who suffer the harshest consequences of climate change, the global poor, women and girls, Indigenous peoples, people of the global South, children, have contributed least to its cause. And you know, as we've talked about human rights in the context of an environment, I want to provide a foundation and a bit of an understanding of what human rights are and why they're so important, especially in the context of the environment. So according to the United Nations, human rights are inherent to all beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. And we are all equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination. And these rights are all interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. These rights are defined in law in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and many other human rights treaties, which we'll talk about in more detail shortly. And through human rights and these treaties, countries, or generally in human rights, they're called states. States have a specific obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. So what does that mean? That means that states have the obligation to respect the human rights of all people in their jurisdiction by refraining from interfering with the enjoyment of these rights. They have the responsibility to protect the human rights of all people by preventing others from interfering in the enjoyment of those rights. And they have the responsibility to fulfill human rights by creating an enabling environment and taking positive action to facilitate the enjoyment of human rights. So that's a lot of information, but essentially means that states and countries, they have to make sure they're not violating human rights, that they're stopping other people from violating human rights, and that they're taking positive action to protect and secure human rights. So just as human rights are indivisible and interdependent, as we just talked about, rights are also indivisible from nature. So, you know, humans and nature, we go hand in hand. We can't separate us from nature. And especially in an Indigenous worldview, we are nature. And we're not separate from animals and nature. We are all one. And accordingly, our rights rely on a healthy environment. And this, I just love this image. It's just one I like to share. It shows a close-up of a small leaf, blood vessels of a human heart, and a river network of the Amazon that I think just shows really beautifully just, you know, cellular connections between all of us. So these are connections that are not just conceptual, but they're actually in practice. And we'll talk actually a little bit more about those tangible elements in terms of fulfillment of human rights from an environmental perspective, but more conceptually, I like a good picture. So I thought I'd share that. So as we talk about human rights in the environment, in the context of international human rights law, it's important to sort of set the stage with where this understanding, you know, at least tangibly in writing, came from. So we have here some examples showing these connections. We have the 1972 Stockholm Declaration. So the UN Conference on Human Environment was held in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972. And this principle states, man, also, as with a lot of you know, human rights and legal documents and instruments, there's a gendered element to this language that I don't necessarily agree with. These are all people have these fundamental rights, but you know, it's generally like to say men. So man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment that permits a life of dignity and well-being, and he bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. In this respect, policies promoting or perpetuating apartheid, racial segregation, discrimination, colonial and other forms of oppression and foreign domination stand condemned and must be eliminated. And then we also have a special rapporteur on human rights and the environment. So this mandate for the special rapporteur was established in 2012 by the Human Rights Council. And the mandate states that all human beings depend on the environment in which we live. A safe, clean, and healthy, sustainable environment is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including rights to life, health, food, water, and sanitation. Without a healthy environment, we are unable to fulfill our aspirations or even live at a level commensurate with minimum standards of human dignity. So this is a nice entry into talking a little bit more about these mechanisms, but it's a really important starting place to understand the first really tangible elements in international human rights law of this connection that Indigenous people have been aware of and advocating for thousands of years, but this is really the first time we start to see it be brought into international law. So, speaking of international law, I'll give a quick little overview here. One of the greatest achievements of the United Nations is the creation of a comprehensive body of human rights law. This is a universal and internationally protected code to which all nations can subscribe. The most obvious example is the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but there are 9 core human treaties that cover many areas of human rights, including children's rights, women's rights, social, economic, and cultural rights, civil and political rights, rights of people with disabilities, rights against torture, and others. And apart from this, there are also many powerful norms and customary law, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that form the full body of international human rights law. While we have conventions that are also known as treaties and are legally binding, these declarations are not legally binding, but they still hold a lot of weight and play a really big role in international law. And Canada must respect, protect, and fulfill all obligations under international human rights law that it has signed on to or ratified. And this is usually done via domestic constitutional obligations. Human rights treaty bodies, which are committees of experts from all around the world, promote and protect these rights, and they assist states or countries in carrying out their human rights obligations. And there's other mechanisms as well, as we've talked about, special rapporteurs, or some of you may have heard of the Universal Periodic Review and these sorts of elements. But the UN is also responsible for the development of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted by its member states. And every year, the UN Secretary General presents an annual Sustainable Development Goal Progress Report. And actually, this past fall, I was in New York and was able to participate in in-person town hall with the Secretary General, talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and providing feedback from NGOs on the topic, which was really exciting and interesting to see those mechanisms take place and those that evaluation of the efficacy and the progress of the implementation of these goals. And it's important to know, like, why I'm talking about human rights so much is because human rights are also an essential component of sustainable development goals. They're essential to achieving sustainable development and ensuring that sustainable development leaves no one behind. And so human rights are central to all of the components of these goals: social, environmental, and economic. And then on the slide here, we have some of the bodies and mechanisms that I use most frequently in work towards environmental justice. So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as we've talked about, the UN Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's some acronyms here that you might hear me use. So CRC, CERD, CEDAW, and UNDRIP are a lot less of a mouthful than some of these titles. So let's talk about children's rights and the environment, one of my favorite things to talk about. By allowing the threat of climate change to go unabated, Canada is violating children's rights under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Failure to address climate change disproportionately impacts girls, especially Indigenous girls, domestically and around the world. Children are disproportionately harmed, principally because they will live longer and long enough to endure the impacts and the worst of these impacts, but also due to their physical, developmental, and social vulnerabilities. According to UNICEF, current and future generations of children face declining water security, rising pressures on food production, and increasing disasters and disease risks, with long-term consequences on their development. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a treaty, and it's actually the most widely ratified treaty in the world. It has a lot of, obviously, incredibly important rights for children, but I just wanted to highlight some in particular that pertain to the environment. So we have Article 2, non-discrimination in the human rights of children. So all children, regardless of their gender, age, nationality, race, have the same access to these rights and to the protection of these rights. Article 6, the inherent right to life. So there's so many ways, obviously, that the environment and climate change impacts children's right to life, but just some of them are that there's a clear link between environmental exposure and climate change causing developmental damage in children and cancers through exposure to toxins. And it's important to note, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the natural defense and reproductive systems of girls are still developing when they're children, which leaves them more vulnerable to the impacts of toxins in their land, waters, air, and to these impacts. And the right to life is also jeopardized by needing access to clean air and water. So environmental degradation and destruction and climate change that impacts our air and waters directly impacts children's right to life. And important to note here that while water and air standards are provincial jurisdiction, protection of these rights is a federal responsibility by Canada as a state, considering they've signed on to these legally binding treaties. Article 24, the right goes hand in hand. They're all, as we've said, all these rights are very interrelated, interdependent, indivisible, but Article 24 is the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health. So again, children who are suffering adverse impacts of environmental degradation are being denied their right to the highest attainable degree and standard of health. And then we have Article 28, the right of the child to education. We know that in times of climate disaster, natural disaster, environmental degradation, children's abilities to go to school is impacted, violating their right to education. And then we have Article 30, the right to culture, religion, and language. And we'll talk about this as well as Article 24 a little bit more in the context of Indigenous children shortly. So these are some of the really substantive rights, right? Like the substantive areas where children's rights are violated. But I also want to talk about probably my favorite rights. I don't know if you're allowed to have favorites, but these are my favorite, which are procedural rights of concern. So this is about how children have their voices be heard and access to information about them. So Article 12 is the right for children to participate in decision-making about matters that impact them. And Article 13 is the right to freedom of expression and to freedom of information. So these rights are really important because they articulate that children have a right to speak up in matters that affect them and what affects children more than the environment and climate change. So their opinion is not only valuable, but it's actually like legally needs to be taken into account. Then also, goes hand in hand with having freedom of expression and freedom of information. So having information to disaggregated data about the impacts of climate change, about emissions, about all of these things that sometimes aren't very easy to come by, perhaps intentionally by various parties, children have a right to know about, and they have a right to have this information be presented clearly and in an easily understood way to them. We'll talk a little bit more about Indigenous children, and then I'm going to give what I love, a great example of children who are articulating these rights really strongly and exercising them. So Indigenous children in particular have specific rights concerns under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Indigenous girls are disproportionately exposed to degraded ecosystems, and they're greatly impacted by deforestation, contamination of drinking water, depletion of fish stocks, and environmental destruction due to resource extraction. So we have Article 24, which is the right to life, which inherently includes rights to clean water. And as I'm sure you know, access to safe drinking water and sanitation is a serious human rights concern for many Indigenous communities in Canada. And the unfortunate reality is that water and sanitation issues are expected to worsen with climate change, not improve, obviously. And Article 30, right to culture. Many traditional practices are being hindered or halted because of climate change, including, you know, fishing, loss of traditional territory, subsequent loss of language. An example of this is a personal one for me, and of great concern to me actually, is about fishing. So my family, I grew up fishing the Fraser River with my mother, my aunt, my grandfather, and now my little siblings. And when I was 15, when I went to the United Nations, I spoke about being very concerned about my children, my future children, not being able to fish or not being able to see the vibrant reds and greens of the sockeye salmon. Much to my unfortunate surprise, this is not a concern that I now have for my children, but it's actually for me, and that I might not get to see the reds and greens of the sockeye salmon for all of my lifetime. And declining fish stocks and numbers due to, you know, overfishing, rising sea levels, rising temperatures, erosion of foreshores have all greatly impacted fish numbers. And accordingly, like the amount we've been able to fish and the fish we've been able to catch over the past few years has just been so low. And this has impacted not only, you know, our ability to have food and sustenance for our family and for our community, but also our ability to exercise our culture and practice this, you know, family, community, cultural practice. So it's just one example of how climate change and environmental degradation impacts culture and actually violates children's rights. And now I have my little siblings who are all children, aren't getting the same experience I did growing up and learning to fish and being taught, you know, the best spots and how to set the net, how to pick the net, how to clean the fish, how to, you know, can them, prepare them, freeze them, and share them with our family and community. They're missing out on that. And that's not just sad and unfortunate, it's a violation of their rights. Oh, here we go. So as promised, I wanted to share an example of children standing up for their rights, and specifically those procedural rights to have a say in matters that affect them and to have information. So these are 15 Canadian youth who are currently in the process of suing the Canadian government for failing to act on climate change. And it's a very complex legal process, but I want to highlight that 10 out of the 15 of the plaintiffs are girls. 7 out of the 15 plaintiffs are Indigenous. And I've had the privilege of working with 2 of the young plaintiffs, Zoe Gramis-Webb and Hannah Edenshaw, to make a presentation to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child for their last review of Canada, where they urged the Canadian government to be held accountable for continued fossil fuel development and climate policy failures. So I don't know, I think it's equal parts disheartening to see it come to this, children having to go to these lengths to assert their voice and their opinion to protect the environment, but it's also inspirational seeing them speak up and take charge and lead the way that, you know, and show us a path that we so desperately need to follow. So it's an example that I encourage everyone to look into and to read the stories and the statements of some of these plaintiffs, because they articulate really well how their rights are being violated, even right to play, because with forest fires in the summer, they couldn't go outside and play basketball and do things with their friends. So they, you know, culturally, there's lots of Indigenous children who explain their rights violations through, again, fires, devastation of lands, and all these different elements, and provides quite diverse, you know, cross-country perspective about what children are experiencing and how it affects them and their schooling and their mental health and their ability to thrive. So moving on from children's rights to women's rights, and I apologize, as I've mentioned, all of these are very intersectional. So you'll notice we dip into the same subjects in different ways, but that's because you can't really separate them, at least in my work. They're all, I can talk about them distinctly, but they're all very interconnected. So as we talk about women's rights, I wanted to share some of the ways that women and girls' rights are protected under international human rights law. So that is through conventions and declarations such as the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, DBAW. And environmental erosion and degradation and disasters caused by climate change exacerbate existing social and economic inequalities, which increases the likelihood of women and girls being sexually assaulted, forced into prostitution, and subjected to extreme poverty and disease. London School of Economics researchers have identified that there's even a gender gap in natural disaster mortality rates, where we see more women die than men. So the gender gap and inequality persists. Girls are also more likely to drop out of school than boys when additional stress is put on the household because of existing discrimination in gender roles. As we mentioned earlier, girls are also extraordinarily vulnerable to toxins. Their reproductive systems are still developing throughout their childhood and adolescence. And we've actually seen with Inuit women through the bioaccumulation of mercury, they have high levels of mercury in their bodies and are unknowingly feeding their children toxic breast milk. So the specific reproductive elements and how those interplay with environmental toxins and in women is really important, and actually a dramatic connection that I don't think enough people know about or speak about. And then another main element that must be talked about, and we'll again talk about a little bit more later, is that extractive industries are also associated with higher rates of violence against women and girls, especially Indigenous women. Women and girls are also leading land events in the world, which, again, while extraordinarily inspirational, comes with a lot of challenges and inequalities. According to Global Witness, women land defenders who act and speak out face gender-specific forms of violence, including sexual violence. Women often have a twin challenge: the public struggle to protect their land, and then the less visible private struggle of defending their right to speak within their communities and within their families. And not all women face the same vulnerability. There is a higher number of reported killings of women belonging to Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities globally. And in Canada, Indigenous women in particular are targeted through a combination of racism and sexism that plays out in very specific harms, including being targeted by the RCMP. And unfortunately, governments often turn a blind eye to violence that these land defenders face, failing to uphold and protect the human rights of land and environmental defenders. In many cases, they're directly perpetrating violence against them, and in others, they're complicit with businesses that do so. So there's lots of different elements at play here. And moving sort of through to Indigenous rights then, I just want to talk a little bit about Indigenous peoples and our perspective. So threats to Indigenous lands, territories, and environment are also threats to Indigenous languages, traditional practices, health, well-being, culture, and lives. And there is an indivisible relationship for Indigenous people between land rights and all other rights. Indigenous territories hold an estimated 80% of Earth's biodiversity. And as we've talked about, Indigenous people, we have such a unique and reciprocal relationship to the land, in which our deep cultural connection between land, water, culture, language, and tradition all includes a responsibility to protect and steward the land for future generations. Again, I just want to share some personal examples from my community about how this connection manifests. So Musqueam, the Musqueam people were Hunkaminam speaking. So in Hunkaminam, we're known as the Humathqueam peoples. And Humathqueam, we get our name from the muthgwe plant. So muthgwe is known as river grass. So this is not, and it's a specific form of river grass. But as you know, people of the river and people of the river grass, we get our name and our language from the land and the muthgwe plant, which is beautiful, but unfortunately, through colonization and environmental degradation, the muthgwe plant is now extinct. So the plant for which we are named on the territory that we've lived on for millennia no longer exists. And that's not a small thing, right? That's what we're named from. So that's one example of the connection between language. Our word in Hunkaminam for huckleberries is actually tapping plant, because traditionally we'd tap the plant and the berries would fall. So connection to place, name, language, and all of these things are all interconnected. So when the land changes, irrevocably, so does our language and so does our culture. So as with, as we've said over and over again, these rights are interconnected, indivisible, and interdependent. And that rings especially true for Indigenous people. And we can even carry on the example with Musqueam, where people of the river, hence why we're people of the salmon and we fish so strongly, and see that connection to fishing, not only in terms of sustenance, but in terms of culture and right to exercise culture. And we've gone so far as to prove that through case law, through the Sparrow decision as well. And so I highly recommend, if anyone doesn't know about it, to look into the Sparrow decision and learn a little bit more about that, because it was, landmark case in identifying how Indigenous culture can evolve and grow with Indigenous people, and how practicing culture is not just about having salmon to eat. It's about the actual ability to fish and to do so as a community. And it starts to try to explain these connections as much as you can, and in a very Western colonial legal sense. But we can't talk about Indigenous people in Canada without talking about Canada's colonial legacy, which again, I'm sure you all know about. But Indigenous peoples have lived in modern Canada since time immemorial. For those of you who don't know what that means for as longer than our human minds can possibly comprehend, people have lived here for. And colonization has resulted in a range of human rights violations, including violence, suppression of Indigenous culture and identity, and social and economic inequalities that persist today. Manifestations of this can be seen through the Indian Act, which is legislation used to govern Indigenous people's rights and lives, residential schools, the 60s scoop, and continued overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice and child welfare systems. And unfortunately, the harms of genocide, colonial violence, and systemic racism are only amplified by the climate crisis. And again, showing this really important connection between colonialism, Indigenous rights, and environmental justice. Indigenous rights are articulated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in international human rights law. And while there are, again, very many important rights in this declaration, I wanted to pull a couple in particular that I think are most relevant to this conversation. Article 29, which is that Indigenous peoples have the right to conservation and protection of the environment, and the right to programs that monitor, maintain, and restore the health of Indigenous peoples. And Article 32, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop strategies for the development and use of their lands, territories, and resources. And states, countries like Canada, shall achieve their free, prior, and informed consent before the approval of any project affecting their lands, territories, or resources, especially impacting their water and minerals. Honorable mentions go to Article 7, the right to life, Article 8, right to culture, Article 10, the right to not be forcibly removed from your land, another important one. Article 11, right to revitalization of traditions. Article 12, the right to maintain and access their cultural sites. And Article 18, the right to participate in decision-making matters that affect them. Very similar to Article 12 and the rights of the child. We can't talk about environmental issues in Canada and Indigenous peoples and women without talking about extractive industries, unfortunately. Wish that wasn't the case, but it is. As many of you know, climate change is directly connected to resource extraction. And as conventional oil and gas sources are depleted, companies are turning to far more environmentally destructive and carbon intensive fossil fuels and extraction methods like tar sands and shale gas. Climate scientists warn that the exploitation of Canadian oil sands would alone double the amount of carbon dioxide emitted in the entire history of global oil consumption and lead to runaway climate change. And Children in areas close to drilling of these sites experience birth defects, low birth weights, and reproduction issues. And there are also astoundingly high rates of cancerous toxins and pollutants found in communities around oil and gas development, for example, the Alberta oil sands. And, you know, the impacts of extractive industries are obviously stark and dire, but there's a way of framing them that I enjoy to use in my work, and that is ecocide. So scholars like Polly Higgins have advocated for the inclusion of this term ecocide in the Rome Statute as a 5th crime against humanity. And she defined ecocide as the extensive loss or damage or destruction of an ecosystem of a given territory, whether by human agency or by other causes, to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been or will be severely diminished. This was one of the original definitions. Since then, an independent expert panel in 2021 developed consensus for an updated definition of ecocide, where they define ecocide as meaning unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe or widespread long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So I think, considering what we know about resource extraction, it's pretty clear that it fits the definition of ecocide very strongly, and intentionally or not. And especially in the context of Indigenous peoples whose land has been irrevocably changed, so much so that they cannot enjoy, use, and inhabit the territory as they were before. So this definition is useful, I think, because it frames what's happening environmentally, not only in Canada, because as we know, climate change knows no borders, but globally as the crime that it is, and which is on an equal level to genocide of people. And that's not to say that ecocide and genocide don't go hand in hand, because they do, and they do impact each other directly. But I think framing it as ecocide, you know, people have different perspectives on how to frame these issues, but I find that it provides a sense of depth, severity, and urgency that it should, and helps you know, make people realize that what's happening is not only severe, but it has impacts that we know are irreversible. And so that element of taking actions that we know will impact future generations and the rights of future generations and their lives is a really important element, not only of, you know, international law, but I think of just how we act and live as human beings. From an Indigenous perspective, we think about actions for 7 generations. And, you know, thinking about our actions today and how that will impact people for 7 generations to come. And I think ecocide fits really well with that narrative and framework of making it clear that damage done that can't be undone is going to impact people not just today, but forever. So ecocide is you know, a relatively new and still developing concept, but one I encourage you to look into and think about and reflect on in your work and in your lives. And we, again, can't talk about ecocide without talking about genocide. So human rights and Indigenous rights abuses and violations are committed and condoned by the Canadian state. And this can be seen through the disproportionately high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In Canada, these high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has been legally defined as a genocide by a national inquiry. And Indigenous women and girls in Canada are 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than members of any other demographic group, and 16 times more likely than Caucasian women. The genocide of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has been linked to resource extraction and development industries. So in talking about the connection and how this manifests, it happens in a lot of ways. Many Indigenous peoples and communities who are opposing pipelines and resource extraction projects are doing so not only due to environmental and health concerns, but also due to concerns with connections to violence against women and girls and violations of their rights of sovereignty and to consent to these projects. The Indigenous women living in proximity to extraction sites and camps suffer from both pollution of the air, water, and land, of their territory, as well as extremely high rates of violence. There's a large proportion of men, transient men, living in work camps or man camps around extractive sites, who, you know, come into communities for short amounts of time, making high salaries with little to no accountability or connection to that local community. And that is manifesting in really high rates of violence in these communities, high rates of addiction, drugs, of sexually transmitted infections, and then also just high numbers of cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls as well. And the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, their national inquiry, released calls to justice. And again, if you haven't read those, I really recommend reading them and looking at them, but there's a couple in particular that pertain to this issue. So 13.1 calls on resource extraction and development industries to consider the safety and security of Indigenous women and girls. And 13.4 calls upon governments to fund further inquiries and studies to better understand the relationship between resource extraction and development and violence against Indigenous women and girls. I'm also happy to share more resources on this connection, including a recording of a panel I did last year at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, sort of on this topic, as well as a recent podcast I did with Pam Palmater. And then also just the final report by this inquiry not only includes recommendations and calls to justice, but it includes testimony from people about these connections, which are tough to read, but I think valuable and important to read. And my PhD dissertation and research is focusing on this connection in more detail as well. So in conclusion, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the success we've had using international human rights law and why I do it and recommend it. International human rights law provides an objective framework where states have already agreed to uphold rights and standards, and they can be criticized for their failures to meet these without getting too much into the weeds or into tricky internal political situations domestically. It's a pretty hard line of international law that has been agreed to. And I find it useful to articulate domestic issues in that sense. And it's actually a very iterative process where we'll see, you know, environmental degradation or damage or rights issues. We'll see those playing out, and we'll support communities in articulating their experiences into rights violations. And then you use that articulation to develop a submission to different human rights bodies, or, you know, statements or engagement of processes. We'll engage international human rights law bodies, and then we'll use their response to bring that back to the community that was experiencing those issues in the first place, and they can use that to leverage their advocacy at home as well. And we see that loop continue, actually, because, you know, we'll support one community to frame their experiences in terms of a submission to, say, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And then that committee will issue a decision. And then that decision will be used by other communities too, to advance their work. And then we'll come into those communities and help them articulate that connection between that decision then and their work, and make a submission accordingly. So it's a very useful process, I think, in leveraging everything we can really to keep people safe and help, you know, work towards environmental justice. It's one, I think the main key factors of our organization is that we pull as many levers as we can, especially the ones that aren't being used very often, and recognizing that attacking these problems through every way possible and through engaging, you know, local, provincial, national, and then international mechanisms, and using them to basically, you know, attack problems from every angle, it's going to lead to progress more of the time than only using one way, right? So international law is not only helpful for us at home, but I've also found it to be really helpful to making progress globally. So like using our examples of cases and success at home. So using that to develop global general comments for United Nations bodies. And then that can be applied to situations and people from other countries as well. So the element of this is, you know, I think it's equally intersectional and it's equally global as climate change is and as the environment is. And so that's probably why I like to use it. I also like to use it because we've been successful with it. So here's some examples. Just to share is we participated in the review of Canada by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2012, which is when I attended as a child. And then in 2020 and 2022, where I supported those two young women alongside Severin Suzuki, and I supported them in making their submissions. And again, organizationally, we made a submission as well. And then other examples include the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. They have an early warning urgent action procedure for urgent situations. Usually we engage that mechanism pertaining to Indigenous peoples because of the racial discrimination elements of the environmental damage and rights issues that they're navigating. We also engaged the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. One example of that is we made a submission to them for the development of a general comment on the rights of Indigenous women and girls. And I don't know if the comment is actually in final stage yet, but there's a draft version of it that is excellent. Like again, it's a global general comment, but it frames so many of these issues really, really well and provides really strong recommendations that can be implemented domestically, but also just used in our advocacy. So, you know, some people ask for recommendations a lot of the time, and I like to pull from these objective international human rights sources that are treaties that Canada signed on to. It makes our job so much easier to point back to their commitments. But so not only is it easier, but they're really, really good. So that was a great submission. Another one is we contributed to the UN Secretary General's report on the impacts of climate change on the human rights of people in vulnerable situations. And we participated in a consultation for that. And then they actually ended up using quotes from our participation in their report. So we've also, this is just a small sample of some of the work that we've done, but just wanted to showcase some of the ways that we've found these mechanisms to be successful. And I'm happy to talk about any of them in more detail as well. But that is sort of the end of my spiel here for you, but I wanted to say hi Sepka, which is thank you all in Hunkamina for having me and for listening so intently.
Thank you so much for that incredibly rich discussion, and the way that you weave together the whole question of rights and the rights of the child and the rights of women and UN DRIP and it seems so obvious, but the observation that these are things that this Canada has signed on to. These are not optional. These are not optional things, right? I mean, we are guilty of violating the law if we don't live up to them. What do you think is the major barrier to having the government really recognize these linkages?
Unfortunately, I think that it's a lack of political willpower, honestly, in my experience. Because I did my master's dissertation sort of on the same topic, and through that, I found that it's not an accident that these two are, that genocide and ecocide or these issues are connected, and that there's choices being made that are contributing to this connection. And I think that's it's really unfortunate, but I think it's also really important that we get our minds around that, like, none of this is an accident, and even genocide has to have intent, right? Like there has to be like planned intent. And one example that I actually enjoy sharing that, again, most people, I didn't know this until I was doing some deep dives into my research, was that when Canada first adopted the definition of genocide, so it was the definition had been confirmed by the United Nations and their genocide convention. When Canada first adopted it, they left out one of the key elements. So genocide has 5 elements, and one of those is the forcible transfer of children from one group to another. And when they imported this definition into our domestic law, they left that one out. And that's not a mistake, right?
Yeah.
Like, they knew that they were doing that through residential schools, and they knew that if they put that into their domestic law, that it would be in direct contradiction with like their state sanctioned actions, right? So there's choices that are being made, and unfortunately, like the wrong ones, I would say.
Yeah.
So in order to move our way out of this situation that we're in, better and different choices have to be made, and ones that prioritize human rights and healthy environment over, you know, industry, if if that makes sense.
And I think what you're saying is that it's this indivisible whole. You can't pick and choose which right you want to fulfill and which ones you don't want to fulfill, or which one you want to recognize and which one you don't want to recognize, because they're all of a whole, right?
Yeah.
Just wondering, I know there might be questions from Maddie or Cass, but do you have an update on the climate change case? Do you know where it's at right now? Are they, do you know what court level they're at, or?
They're appealing currently, is my understanding, and they're hopeful that the appeal will go through. So it's not like, the update is that they're working on
Okay.
the update is that it's not stalled, like it's not over. It's in process, and they're continuing with it, and I'm hoping that it's more successful. I fundamentally disagree with the reasons that it was dismissed in the first place. I mean, I feel like climate change and right to life are very clearly connected. So there's not like a strong update on that front, but one of my coworkers is actually legal guardian to one of the plaintiffs. So it's been really interesting to be a part of that process and see that. But I think my favorite part of it is the youth, and seeing how incredible they are in articulating that. But fingers crossed that their second attempt goes better.
All the way to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
First of all, thank you. That was really informative. It's really great. Well, maybe not great. Unfortunate to hear that Canada is like violating a lot of human rights and stuff, but I guess kind of good to be aware of all of that. But my question is about your community and sort of the differences between what you experience in like the rest of Canadian society versus the sort of, I think you said matrilineal. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Matriarchal, but yeah.
Matriarchal, that's what it was. Yeah. And kind of like how, like what specifically was different in your community versus the rest of Canada?
So I think, like, first and foremost, one of the things that I think people know, but you have to put it out there, is that the majority of BC is unceded, right, compared to the rest of the country, which means it was never surrendered by war or treaty. So Musqueam, we've never surrendered any of our rights to our sovereignty, to our land, territories, people, any of the sort. So it inherently puts us in a different position than the rest of the country, first and foremost, as well as other nations in BC. And I think that's actually part of what really drew me to this work, was that I felt like I was in a really unique position based off my community and my people, and in the province that I'm in, to make stands for environmental justice that actually might have chance of success, really, and actually. And I think that's also supported by the RCMP and the government, who recognize that Indigenous resistance in BC is like a nexus of these issues, and that whatever way it goes in BC is going to have national impact. So that, I think, first and foremost distinguishes the majority of nations in BC. There's a couple of treaties, but for the most part, it's all unceded. And then Musqueam, so being matriarchal, it means that the power and decisions of our community come from the women. So some examples of that is that we have in our cultural practices, we have speakers and speakers of family and speakers. The speakers are male. And so again, people assume through a lot of these things that, oh, like, how could you be matriarchal? Then they just assume we're not. But the reality is that the speakers are male, but it's the women who like tell them what to say. They say what the women told them to say, right? So that's one example. And then so I sort of loosely alluded to it, but one of our former counselors, Morgan Guerin, he's just an incredible source of knowledge. And he told me this once, and it stuck with me literally forever, that, you know, Indigenous people, we have our strife with each other too. We're not immune to that. And if there was ever any problems, that the men would go out, you know, to defend our territory to other communities, and that the women would stay back home. And it was not, again, it was not because they were the more vulnerable group. It's because they were the stronger group. And so if people made it through the men and they got to the women, which happened a couple of times, and like, disclaimer for graphic, if the men returned, there would just be body parts everywhere, because the women would just absolutely destroy intruders and protect their community and their children. Women were also our weavers, and in Musqueam, our weavings are not just weavings for art, they actually carry story and culture and tradition. So the responsibility of weaving and of you know, solidifying that history and you know, having that be passed down to generations is a really important part of our role. You know, in terms of women are you know, healers and know about the plants and the systems for medicine, and those sorts of things. My Auntie Jerry is a really exceptional woman for that in our community. She has salves and teas for just about everything. I'm pretty sure my mom, with her last child, her fourth son, she was ready for him to be out of her, and she just wanted to go into labor. And so my Auntie Jerry gave her Devil's Club tea, which is really unpleasant but very effective, and ulican grease. So the way, you know, the women are in charge of those sorts of things as well, which are really key and important roles. And yeah, I'm very, very lucky. My mother is a very strong, incredible Musqueam woman, and she holds a lot of knowledge. And then also, you know, my grandma as well. If I need any information or any sort of, you know, family lineage questions, anything like that, I go to my grandma, because she knows absolutely everything. So those are just some, I guess, personal examples of that. But, you know, it's interesting, because I think gender roles can be like a really dirty word nowadays. But in our community, there certainly were gender roles, but the reality is that they were balanced and equal, and none of them were good or bad. And it was in a way that people could live in harmony and coexist, and as a community, and as a sustainable community, and a reflective community that, you know, prioritized family values and connection and those sorts of things. And we also, you know, had two-spirit people who could do both and were actually celebrated for both. So I think it's interesting, because like different communities have different approaches to those sorts of things for sure. But I definitely feel very lucky that, you know, if my father's passed away, but if he was alive, my boyfriend, if he wanted to propose, he'd ask my mom, sort of thing, you know. So I feel lucky to have that in my community for sure.
Thanks. Thank you.
Any other questions? That was just amazing. Like, I learned so much, and you brought together just such a wide range of, you know, the legalities, the personal stories, and the, I think, you know, fundamentally thinking about environmental issues brings you to how things are connected. How are things connected? And I'm a political scientist as well, so I kind of gravitate to policy in the state, and I love these discussions of the, you know, what are the things that we've actually agreed to, and why can't we live up to them?
Well, they already exist, right? And I'm a big fan, and as I'm sure you are, of like not recreating the wheel if you don't have to. Like,
exactly.
the arguments are already there. They've already agreed
Yeah.
with them, and so it's just about, I think, pointing to those, and not very many people do that.
Yeah.
And I find it can be very useful, and also just like even if the impacts aren't like super strong. Sometimes like a lot of people see international law or the United Nations as being like very soft and having like no like physical power or enforcement, you know. But I see it as in a really effective way of increasing public knowledge and awareness of these things, because I think human rights are something we can all get behind. Like even people who are climate deniers, like, you know, everyone wants their rights. We saw that during COVID. People love their rights, right? So I think human rights are something that everyone wants and can get behind. And then also even just seeing, you know, seeing as one of the committees that we made a submission to released a decision that was really influential for Indigenous communities, and seeing them get to like hold up that piece of paper and say, look, like, we're not wrong. Like, this is a violation of our rights. Like, we're in the right. Like, even if, you know, Canadian law right now says that you can do this to us, international law, which is supposed to supersede that, disagrees. And Indigenous law disagrees too, but unfortunately, we're not really at a place where Indigenous law has the same respect and value, but international law does. And it's supposed to, by rule of law, mean more. So it's something, right?
So on behalf of RCEN, Canadian Environmental Network, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. The next event in our SDG Caucus speaker series is on, correct me if I'm wrong, April 19th. Is that right? And we have MJ Torres, who's working as a coordinator for World Wildlife Fund. She is a youth advisor for Canadian Council for Youth Prosperity and Vibrant Healthcare Alliance. So I think thanks so much, and we're so grateful that you could spend your time with us today on behalf of RCEN. I really appreciate it, and we hope to have more discussions and dialogue in the future.
For sure. Thank you for having me and being such a lovely and safe group of people to talk to.